I would like to introduce the fourth and final speaker, Christiaan Deynoot from South Pole. And he will be speaking about the Green Deal and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to be the topic of the for the day. So you are invited to take some notes. And Christiaan, I can see you now. I hand it over to you. You can start sharing your screen.
Super. Thank you so much, Monica.
Yes, thank you.
Briefly check for my screen to share. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yep. Great. I'll go in present mode. Yes, thank you, Monica. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts on this groundbreaking policy package that the European Commission has formulated. I think it's quite important to note, maybe, first and foremost, is that, of course, the carbon border adjustment measure is really one very specific climate policy tool that is introduced under the Green Deal, whereas the Green Deal itself is, of course, and we'll get to that in a moment, hyper comprehensive and holistic, touching on a wide variety of sectors with a wide variety of climate policy tools. And so we'll have some of them feature in this presentation. I wanted to go with you a little bit through, what are the trends of the Green Deal and the trends regarding the structure and the principles that guide it. What is the expected impact, and how do we see the implementation taking place? So these are the main elements, a bit of context, general outline of the Green Deal, and then an introduction to the carbon border adjustment measures. But maybe first a brief introduction of myself. As Monica said, Christiaan Deynoot, I'm a Dutch national, and I work for South Pole, which is a global sustainability consultancy. And so we help private and public sector companies to transition towards a more sustainable operation. I personally focus a lot on the Benelux, but before I joined South Pole a couple of months ago, I worked in Brussels for about 8 years as a policy advisor, lobbyist on energy and climate policies, which is why I have some ideas about the Green Deal. So how did we actually get here, and is it really so important? I think it is very important because why we got there is as Europe is not only because of climate change. I mean, yes, of course, there is environmental degradation and climate change. And as a result, we need to change our economic growth models. That's clear, that applies to all. But we here also face growing societal pressure. The demonstrations, everybody has seen them. There's no going back, really. But at the same time, and this is more particular to Europe, it offers an opportunity for Europe to excel in a particular area at the global stage, to take leadership, especially now that the geopolitical center is shifting more towards Asia. And so this is a way to, in a way, mitigate that reduced level of influence that Europe has in the world. And finally, the Green Deal is a way for Europe to actually set rules, and so that leadership that I just spoke about is a way for the EU to be that regulatory superpower that everybody always says it is. And why is that important? It's because ultimately it influences the competitiveness of European companies vis-a-vis others abroad. This is a nice segue to the fact that the Green Deal is really, in essence, not about climate. This is Europe's new economic growth strategy. The goal is to become the first climate neutral, circular, and competitive continent in the world. And this takes account of, in particular, these three features, right? So competitiveness, already spoke about this a little bit, sustainability, clearly, and equitability. So that really relates to the social aspects of the climate transition, of course. Those drivers actually, yeah, they feed into the Green Deal, and they turn the Green Deal into an economic growth strategy rather than a climate action strategy, really. I mean, of course, it's important to understand, for context, what does it really mean to become the first climate neutral continent, right? So there's a couple of features that are important here. I mean, one is that it's constrained to the emissions on EU territory. So all the targets of the EU only relate to those emissions. Negative emissions, so-called negative emissions, where, as many of you will no doubt know, where carbon is absorbed from the atmosphere either via technological or more natural solutions, are considered key in order to ultimately meet the targets that we set. It means that all other policies are framed by this climate neutrality target, and it involves all people in Europe across all sectors. We're all in that same boat, in that same Green Deal train. Because it has an enormous scope, right? To become that type of continent, we're talking about the Green Deal as a policy package that has a scale similar to the introduction of the euro or the introduction of the single market. So it conditions really our activities in Europe up to 2050. So the next 30 years are conditioned by the Green Deal, by this headline target of 2050 climate neutrality. The timing is critical. Everybody is talking about economic recovery. What does that mean for the role of the Green Deal in the context of that economic recovery? And the reach, of course, it is really, it drives investors across, it drives investors across the board, and yeah, there's really no escaping, and the impact is of a scale, beyond compare. So if you, as an economic operator, as a company, if you don't align with the Green Deal, you will be left behind. You know, there's no other way. Of course, the level of ambition that you show in your alignment with the Green Deal when it comes to issues that do not relate to regulatory compliance, that is up to each company. But the compliance itself is a necessity. So just briefly on the sort of the outline, and how is it really structured and what are the most impactful initiatives? So the foundations of the Green Deal are quite clear, I think. I mean, they go back to a lot of the climate and economic policies that the EU has produced over, and energy policies that we have produced over the past years. But, so the levers that are being pulled under the Green Deal are also very much known. We're talking about a lot of energy efficiency, renewable energy, etc. But there's other elements in here that we didn't know so much before. So these are 6 key aspects of the Green Deal that show that this is a new approach. So making this a just transition. So that's quite clear. I mean, there's no such thing as moving out of coal mining areas, leaving everybody behind just because of the climate transition. No, these people will have to be compensated, and these issues have to be addressed. So it has to be a fair transition, a just transition. So industrial policy, second point. Previously, the EU did not really do industrial policy, and that's targeting specific sectors and technologies with state aid in order to beef up their competitiveness. But now we see that industrial policy is actually at the heart of the Green Deal, also in line with the fact that you see this emerging in other countries in the world, such as the US and China, where industrial policy is now entirely okay. So we have this climate bank, 50% of the European Investment Bank over time will be turned into a climate portfolio. So all their investments will relate to climate. We have the introduction of climate action into the EU's international trade policy. So adherence to the Paris Agreement, for example, is now meant to be in all trade agreements that the EU closes with its partners. They set rules for a different type of world that we need to operate in by the time of 2050. And ultimately, they relate to building an economy that is circular in nature, where in the end, there is no such thing as waste, but all raw materials become really secondary raw materials after the use of products in the context of reuse, recycling, etc. These are fairly new ways of thinking that underpin the Green Deal, and that indicates that this is a comprehensive approach to tackling the challenges that we face. The European Commission has pinpointed 10 specific priority areas. And I will share this presentation afterwards, so please feel free to look at it then. But just to go through them a little bit, not in too much detail, but is that, of course, we're talking about the 2050 and 2030 greenhouse gas emissions reductions target. The 2030 target in particular is now under discussion, and that will also address the need for higher targets in the sphere of energy efficiency and renewable energy. Which brings us to the second point: supplying clean, affordable, and securing energy, which is a key element of the Green Deal and our climate policies of the past. The role of industry, the role of the private sector to contribute, the focus on specifically the built environment as one of the biggest emission sources that has not been effectively addressed yet. Then on the right hand, you have that is zero pollution. So this really focuses on the development of new types of chemicals, more chemicals that can be recycled. It focuses on products and the way that they are used, and the way that they are designed, so that they, at the design stage, it is already taken into account that they will have to be recycled later on. We're talking about restoring ecosystems and biodiversity to enhance their carbon sink factor, so the absorption of CO2. We're talking about overhauling our entire agricultural system in order to bring it in line with the planetary boundaries. And we're talking about a massive shift, of course, as you all know, in the way that we conduct mobility, shifting to different forms of mobility, electrifying mobility, making it smarter, connecting it with the other units in the electricity grid that are increasingly being added, such as storage capacity, such as smart buildings, etc. And so, of course, then you have financing the transition, a clear thing, new funds, new ways of actually financing this massive undertaking, and that element of the just transition. Again, it's also relating to learning programs and funding programs to make sure that nobody is left behind. So those are the main areas, the 10 priority areas of the Green Deal. Here, what I've done is outline some of the key initiatives that we are expecting under these 10 priority areas. Again, we don't have time to go into this now in detail, but I invite you to look at it afterwards. And you see there in the first one, the climate neutral Europe by 2050, that priority area, that the carbon border adjustment measure is a key initiative there. So let me say a few words about this. I will just introduce this as a curtain raiser. A colleague of mine will say a few more words about this on Sunday in advance of your discussions. But let me maybe just frame it a little bit for those that are not so familiar with this. So really, in the end, these carbon border adjustment measures are a way for us to manage competitiveness. The competitiveness of EU businesses as the costs that they are experiencing increase in line with the compliance needs of more ambitious climate policy. So the rationale, therefore, is to make sure that these extra costs that these European companies are facing do not lead to reduced competitiveness, do not lead to non-EU companies taking advantage of this by producing under less costs, because they have less compliance needs, because climate policies in that specific country are less stringent. Of course, there is a rationale behind this, but this relates to something that we call carbon leakage, which is that when production moves out of Europe as a result of more stringent climate policies and the costs related to that, then effectively there is a leakage of carbon out of the EU internal market towards other countries. And so therefore, in the end, the impact of more ambitious climate policy is limited. But in essence, really, this is about competitiveness, protecting the competitiveness of EU business. And it has also quite a bit of a history. I mean, what we're doing now is, under the EU ETS, the emissions trading system, is we give free allowances, emission allowances, to some sectors in order to prevent or address that carbon leakage risk and make sure that they remain competitive. And so that's the kind of system that we have today. But we have tried, as the EU previously, to introduce a carbon adjustment measure, which was for addressing the emissions related to flights from non-EU countries into the EU. And so that measure sought to address the part of the flight taking place outside the EU, so extra EU aviation emissions. But that failed horribly, horribly, after immense opposition from countries such as Russia, China, and the US, who obviously fear that, and that comes to the third point, they fear that this is a form of external governance, whereby we as the EU are effectively taxing companies outside our own boundaries. And that obviously touches on something that, it touches on the sovereignty of countries to set their own taxation. And so therefore, they expressed great discontent, and in the end, this measure was not introduced at the time. And so to ensure that this discontent is addressed today, when we are formulating these new measures, it means that the form has to be, the form of the measures have to be WTO compliant, which is critical and not so easy. That is why it is not clear yet what kind of form we're actually talking about. Will it be a tax that is levied at the border on imported products, or will the emissions related to imports be covered under the EU ETS, or will we establish a different pot of emissions related to imports that are tackled in a similar way as the ETS, but apart from it, well, etc. So there are a number of forms that are currently being considered. It's not at all clear yet which one it should be. I mean, ultimately...
sorry to interrupt, but just to let you know that you have 3 minutes left.
Exactly. So that's a very important point, because I was just about to say my last sentence, because obviously the impact depends very much on the form and the sectors that will be covered. It's very likely that we'll test it first with a number of sectors before potentially expanding it more broadly. So not an easy measure. You can expect lots of genuine interest from other countries, non-EU countries, that are getting in the way of this. And it's not at all clear yet if they can be introduced in a WTO compliant way. Which brings us to the questions and answers. Monica, I'll hand over to you.
Great.